The wind across the Texas high plains was a restless spirit, never truly silent. It sighed through the parched, brittle blades of buffalo grass, a constant mournful sound that lifted the fine crimson dust into the air, making it shimmer and breathe like a living entity. That same relentless dust had settled into the intricate map of lines around Eliza's weary eyes, a permanent stain mirroring the deeper anxiety etched into her soul. She hummed almost unconsciously, a half-remembered melody from a different life, her mother's tune from the verdant, rolling hills of Pennsylvania, a place where rain fell like a blessing and the earth yielded willingly. Here, the notes felt thin, alien, fragile against the vast, indifferent expanse. Her hands, chapped and calloused, moved in the familiar, gentle rhythm of rocking baby Lily. Lily, a small miracle of warmth and resilience, gripped a fold of Eliza's faded calico dress with a fist surprisingly strong for her tiny size, a vital anchor in the swirling uncertainty of their existence. Their dwelling, more a desperate collection of sun-bleached planks clinging stubbornly to the baked earth than a proper home, perched precariously on the desolate edge of what Silas, her husband, still called the threshold of fortune, with a bravado that rang increasingly hollow. The shack seemed to shrink with each passing day, drawing inward, a cold pocket in the relentless furnace of the Texas sun. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down, stealing moisture from the air, the cracked earth, and, it felt, from the very marrow of hope itself. It baked the resentment and disappointment into the soil of Eliza's heart. Silas existed in the periphery, a ghost haunting the edges of their small, fractured family. His physical presence was often a heavy silence, a brooding weight that absorbed the scant comfort Eliza tried to cultivate. But his spirit? That drifted miles away, lost in the shimmering heat mirages dancing on the horizon. His eyes, which Eliza remembered as warm pools reflecting shared dreams, now held a restless, feverish sheen. They perpetually scanned landscapes she couldn't see, landscapes conjured from wishful thinking and fueled by cheap whiskey, mythical gold strikes just over the next sun-scorched mesa, phantom cattle herds waiting to be claimed, million-dollar contracts whispered by fellow dreamers and predatory con artists in dusty saloons. He spoke of these looming fortunes with a grating, fever-pitched intensity, his voice raspy from dust and drink, yet his pockets remained stubbornly empty, lined only with lint and the brittle fragments of broken promises as ephemeral as the dawn mist devoured by the rising sun. His words, intended as inspiration, landed like heavy stones in the quiet desperation of the shack, useless and cold. Eliza battled the slow unraveling of her own spirit by anchoring herself to the repetitive tapestry of daily chores. Hauling water from the dwindling creek, its trickle a weak, thready pulse against the land's insatiable thirst, became an act of sheer defiance. Tending the pathetic, sun-blasted patch of garden behind the shack, coaxing a few stubborn collard greens and stringy beans from the cracked, reluctant earth that yielded mostly rocks and withered disappointment, felt less like farming and more like a desperate prayer whispered into the indifferent wind. Each evening, under the vast, star-strewn indifference of the night sky, a canvas overwhelming in its silent majesty, she would whisper fairy tales to Lily. Tales of enchanted forests thick with dew-kissed leaves, talking animals wise and kind, benevolent princes who rescued not with swords but with compassion, worlds spun from memory and longing, diametrically opposed to their harsh, monochrome reality. These rituals, performed with mechanical precision, were flimsy walls erected against the encroaching tide of despair. Her love for Lily wasn't just an anchor. It was a fiercely guarded ember, radiating a small, vital warmth against the pervasive chill of Silas's emotional absence and the profound, soul-deep loneliness of the plains. Memory, sharp-edged and unwelcome, often ambushed her in the quiet moments. She saw Silas as he first appeared at her father's farm back east, a whirlwind of charm and restless energy arriving in a landscape where the earth was rich, black, and forgiving, where seasons followed a predictable rhythm, and life, though demanding, felt fundamentally secure. He had seemed so different then, or perhaps she acknowledged with a pang of bitterness. She had simply chosen to see only the polished surface, blinded by youthful infatuation. His eyes had held a genuine spark then, his smile quick, infectious. He painted Texas with words like sunrises, a land of limitless horizons, boundless opportunity, where a man with grit and vision could carve out an empire from the raw wilderness. Her father, a man grounded in the practicalities of soil and seasons, wary of easy promises and flamboyant pronouncements, had harbored quiet doubts. His steady gaze had questioned Silas's soaring rhetoric, his cautious silence a counterpoint to Silas's fervent declarations. But Eliza, swayed by a handsome face, impassioned speeches about destiny, and the potent, naive belief that love could conquer any obstacle, had readily traded her known, safe world for the shimmering allure of the unknown. She had truly believed their shared love, combined with relentless hard work, would weave a sanctuary, a haven, even in this stark, untamed territory. The high plains, however, offered no sanctuary, only relentless tests. Scorching heat that blistered unprotected skin and drove sane men to madness. Terrifying dust storms, black rollers, that descended like biblical plagues, turning midday into a suffocating, grit-filled night, choking lungs and burying hope beneath layers of red earth. Failed crops that withered on the stalk, mirroring the decay of dreams. And overarching all of it, a profound, soul-crushing isolation that pressed in from all sides, magnifying every fear, every doubt. The land demanded resilience, fortitude. But Silas, faced with its brutal indifference, didn't steel himself. He retreated. He sought refuge not in perseverance, but in increasingly elaborate fantasies and the dulling oblivion of alcohol. His absences stretched from days into weeks. Initially, the excuses were plausible: hunting scarce game, scouting dwindling water sources. Then they became vaguer, more grandiose. Exploring opportunities in the chaotic, burgeoning boomtowns that erupted like festering sores on the plains. Raw, transient settlements, teeming with rough-faced oil men, card sharps, grifters, and desperate laborers. These towns pulsed with a frantic energy fueled by greed and desperation, centered around raucous saloons where tinny pianos endlessly churned out discordant tunes and shadowy backrooms hosted all-night gambling dens where fortunes were won and far more often lost. Eliza knew with a gut-wrenching certainty she desperately tried to bury that Silas's opportunities were most frequently discovered shimmering at the bottom of a cheap whiskey bottle or hanging on the turn of a fateful card. His returns became events freighted with dread. He rarely brought back anything tangible, perhaps a handful of coins quickly lost again, or more often, nothing but the stale, sour cloud of cheap liquor clinging to his clothes, a simmering, unpredictable irritability that could ignite into rage without warning, or worse, a chilling, vacant silence that felt like a heavy cloak of judgment. When he did speak, it was often to rail against the unforgiving weather, the distant, indifferent government, the Comanche tribes whose ancestral lands they encroached upon, dismissed with casual, ignorant slurs, blaming everyone and everything except the flawed architect of his own repeated failures. Eliza tried time and agonizing time again to breach the wall of self-pity and delusion he'd constructed around himself. She attempted to remind him of their dwindling supplies, of Lily's needs, of the promises he'd made, of the shared responsibility they bore. Her words, however gentle or desperate, seemed to dissolve before reaching him, deflected by his resentment or met with that distant, dismissive stare that made her feel like an inconvenient burden, an anchor dragging him down from his mythical, grand destiny. Only Lily remained untouched by the corrosive bitterness, a pure, unwavering beacon. Her gurgling laughter was a melody that cut through the oppressive silence. The way she reached for Eliza with absolute, unquestioning trust melted the hardness forming around Eliza's heart. The soft, warm weight of her small body, sleeping against Eliza's chest in the lonely darkness, was a tangible reminder of what truly mattered. Eliza poured every scarce ounce of her dwindling emotional and physical energy into creating a protective bubble of normalcy for her daughter, shielding her as best she could from the oppressive weight of Silas's moods and the stark, unrelenting bleakness of their existence. She taught Lily the names of the few stubborn wildflowers that dared to push through the cracked earth. Indian paintbrush, prairie verbena, tiny splashes of defiant color. She sang the lullabies her own grandmother had sung in a gentler, greener climate. She painted pictures with words of the world she had left behind: cool, mossy forests, sparkling rivers, friendly neighbors, a vibrant tapestry starkly contrasting their current monochrome reality. She made a silent, fierce vow, repeating it like a mantra in the lonely pre-dawn hours. I will protect you, Lily. I will find a better life for us, somehow, no matter what it takes. Mama, tell about the bluebirdies, Lily would sometimes demand, her small hand tugging insistently at Eliza's worn skirt, her innocent voice a lifeline pulling Eliza back from the precipice of her own despair. Eliza would force the weariness from her face, conjure a smile that felt brittle but genuine for her daughter, smoothing Lily's fine, dark hair back from her forehead. Oh, the bluebirds, my lily bug, she'd begin, her voice softening, weaving a memory into a shield against the harsh present. Back where Mama grew up, the bluebirds flashed like tiny chips of the sky come down to earth. They'd sit on the fence posts and sing from sunup till the stars came out. The sweetest songs you ever did hear, like little silver bells ringing just for you. As she spoke, she would close her eyes for a moment, picturing the impossible green, the impossible blue, holding onto the memory like a talisman against the endless sun-bleached crimson dust. The dawn that finally broke Silas's latest 2-day absence was pale and thin, the vast Texas sky washed in weak, insipid watercolors. The lonely, piercing cry of a red-tailed hawk sliced through the pre-dawn silence, amplifying the profound emptiness of the plains. Silas stumbled into the shack just as the first weak light touched the horizon. He looked ravaged, gaunt beneath the grime, his clothes coated in layers of dust, his eyes bloodshot and shadowed with an exhaustion that seemed soul-deep, far beyond mere physical fatigue. But stranger than his appearance was his demeanor. Not the usual sullen silence or simmering resentment, but a heavy, coiled stillness, an unnatural quiet that prickled the hairs on Eliza's neck. He actively avoided her gaze, his eyes darting around the small space as if looking for escape routes. He brushed off her tentative questions about his whereabouts with mumbled, incoherent replies, waving a dismissive hand thick with grime. Then, with a sudden jarring burst of agitated energy, he began stuffing their meager belongings into a rough burlap sack. Eliza watched in numb confusion as he gathered her only spare dress, a faded blue gingham, carefully mended, a thin patched quilt that had been her mother's, and Lily's threadbare but cherished receiving blanket. His movements were jerky, hurried, his hands trembling slightly. He began speaking rapidly, the words tumbling out in a rushed, uneven stream, disconnected fragments of a narrative that made little sense. He spoke of a sanctuary, a safe haven, a cousin, a name Eliza had never heard him utter before, in a town called Prosperity, supposedly just a day's ride eastward. A place, he claimed with forced conviction, where Eliza and Lily could wait comfortably, securely, while he finalized a monumental deal, the elusive breakthrough that would finally catapult them into the life of ease and plenty he'd endlessly promised. Prosperity. The name struck Eliza as a particularly cruel irony in this barren, unforgiving landscape. And a cousin? Silas, prone to bragging about distant, influential connections, had never once breathed a word about family residing anywhere in this desolate territory. A cold dread, sharp and twisting like a barbed wire knot, began to bloom in Eliza's stomach. Why the sudden, desperate urgency? If this deal was so close, why couldn't they wait here until it was finalized? Why the secrecy, the averted eyes, the palpable air of frantic haste? Questions swirled like the dust devils dancing outside their flimsy door, but years of grinding hardship, of constant wearing disappointment and gnawing worry, had eroded her resilience, sapped her will to argue, to demand truth. She was bone-weary, soul-tired, desperate enough to grasp at even the most dubious threadbare sliver of hope dangled before her. And buried deep, beneath layers of accumulated hurt and bitter disillusionment, a foolish, stubborn flicker of loyalty. To the memory of the younger, hopeful man she thought she had married still stubbornly glowed, that ghost of a gentler, more optimistic Silas, however faded and spectral, whispered against her better judgment, urging her to trust him, just one last time. Silas, what is truly happening? Eliza finally managed, her voice barely a whisper, thick with unspoken fear, the words catching in her dry throat. Where are we really going? Tell me the truth. Silas flinched as if struck, still refusing to meet her eyes. He turned abruptly and roughly scooped Lily up from the pallet where she'd been sleeping. His movements lacked even the rare, fleeting tenderness he sometimes showed their daughter. Just trust me on this, Eliza. For once, just trust me. It's for the best. You and the girl will be safe, looked after proper in Prosperity. Then when my ship comes sailing in, and it's coming soon, real soon, we'll have everything we ever dreamed of. He deposited Lily onto the battered, splintered seat of their old buckboard wagon, the gesture abrupt, almost careless. Lily, sensing the thick, unfamiliar tension, her small face mirroring her mother's anxiety, looked from her father's grim, set jaw to her mother's pale, worried expression, her lower lip beginning to tremble. Eliza swallowed the hard, painful knot of fear lodged in her throat, forced a weak, trembling smile for her daughter, knelt quickly, and hugged her tight, whispering reassurances she didn't feel. The journey eastward unfolded under a pall of heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the rhythmic, mournful creak of the wagon wheels grinding over the uneven ground, and the ceaseless sigh of the hot wind. Dust, fine and red, coated everything, their clothes, their faces, the meager, unchanging landscape itself. The terrain grew progressively harsher, devolving from sparse grassland into a stark, unwelcoming panorama of jagged rock outcroppings, thorny mesquite bushes, and sun-baked clay. The wind became a persistent tormentor, whipping stinging grit into their eyes, carrying the relentless, suffocating heat that shimmered above the baked earth. Eliza held Lily close on her lap, trying to shield her small body from the worst of the brutal sun and the choking dust, her own heart a leaden weight in her chest heavy with a nameless, suffocating foreboding. Silas stared straight ahead, his profile rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped the worn leather reins. Finally, under the punishing glare of the brutal afternoon sun, they reached the place Silas had called Prosperity. It was a cruel mockery of its name. It wasn't a town, not in any recognizable sense of community or permanence. It was a raw, ugly scar gouged upon the land, a haphazard, chaotic scattering of dusty canvas tents, a few crudely constructed wooden shacks leaning at precarious angles, all clustered like desperate fungi around a single, deeply rutted track that served as a main street. The air hung thick, stagnant, and heavy, saturated with the cloying miasma of cheap liquor, stale sweat, unwashed bodies, festering refuse, and an underlying palpable stench of desperation and decay. Even in the harsh, unforgiving daylight, loud, coarse laughter and the tinny, discordant plinking of an out-of-tune piano spilled brazenly from a garishly painted two-story building, its peeling red paint resembling sunburnt, flaking skin. Smoke curled lazily from its crooked chimney, and it was towards this garish red building, not a welcoming cousin's homestead, that Silas guided the weary, dust-caked horse. A faded wooden sign, swaying and creaking rhythmically in the hot, dry wind, hung crookedly above the swinging saloon doors, the gilded cage. The sounds emanating from within, the raucous male laughter, the jarring music, the faint echo of shattering glass, sent a visceral shudder of pure revulsion down Eliza's spine. Her blood ran cold. Silas pulled the wagon to a rough halt, directly in front of the saloon. He didn't need to force her out. The horrific, unthinkable realization was already dawning in her mind, cold and sharp as a shard of ice piercing her heart. He hadn't brought her to safety. He hadn't brought her to family. He had brought her to market. "Wait here," Silas mumbled, his voice thick, strangled, still refusing to meet her gaze. He clumsily climbed down from the wagon seat, his movements stiff, awkward. He walked towards a woman lounging insolently in the shadowed doorway of the red building. The unspoken word "sold" hung in the stifling, dusty air, obscene, unbelievable. Eliza watched, frozen in numb, paralyzing horror, as Silas exchanged hushed, urgent words with the woman. The woman's face was a hard, painted mask, layers of cheap cosmetics failing to hide the calculating coldness in her eyes. Maeve, the proprietress, Eliza would learn later. Maeve listened, then nodded curtly, her gaze flicking dismissively towards Eliza and Lily in the wagon. Eliza saw the distinct glint of heavy coins passing from Maeve's hand to Silas's trembling one. More money than Eliza had seen Silas possess in years. He shoved the coins deep into his trouser pocket, his shoulders hunching defensively. Then, without a word, without a backward glance, he turned, climbed back onto the wagon seat and roughly picked up the reins. No explanation, no apology, no farewell. Lily, confused and frightened by the abrupt stop, the jarring sounds from the saloon and her father's strange, tense behavior, began to cry, a bewildered, heart-wrenching sound that cut through the thick, unforgiving air. "Papa, Mama, where we going?" The sound of her daughter's distress finally pierced Eliza's paralysis. A raw scream tore from her throat. "Silas! What are you doing? Silas! Lily!" she shrieked, lunging forward from her seat towards the front of the wagon. But Silas violently yanked the reins. The startled horse lunged forward. The wagon lurched violently, throwing Eliza off balance. She tumbled awkwardly, landing hard in the thick, choking dust of the street. "Mama, Papa, we're going," Lily cried out again, her small face crumpled. In terror, her tiny hand reaching back desperately towards the figure of her mother receding in the dust. "Mama, Mama!" The wagon carrying her husband and her beloved child rattled away down the rutted track, growing smaller and smaller, until it was just a dark, indistinct shape swallowed by the swirling crimson dust and the indifferent, blinding glare of the Texas sun. The faint, desperate sound of Lily's cries faded into the vast, empty silence, leaving Eliza alone, struggling to rise from the dirt, abandoned in the desolate street before the leering red facade of the gilded cage. The bitter, acrid taste of betrayal burned like ash in her mouth. A moment later, the heavy front door of the saloon slammed shut behind her, shoved by an unseen hand from within. The sound was stark, brutally final, like a prison gate clanging shut, sealing her fate in this god-forsaken corner of the world. Stepping across the threshold of the gilded cage was like plunging into a different, suffocating element. The air wasn't just air. It was a palpable entity, thick, heavy, and foul, a noxious, clinging blend of stale tobacco smoke, spilled cheap whiskey, the cloying sweetness of cheap perfume, desperately trying and failing to mask the underlying stench of sweat, desperation, and something akin to decay, moral, physical, spiritual. Dim, greasy light emanated from a few strategically placed oil lamps, casting long, distorted shadows that danced eerily across gaudy, water-stained floral wallpaper peeling in strips, scarred and rickety wooden furniture, and the long, dark wood bar dominating one wall. The bar top was sticky with the residue of spilled secrets, cheap liquor, and shattered hopes. Maeve's sharp, predatory gaze swept over Eliza, lingering, assessing her from dusty head to worn-out shoes with an unnerving, invasive thoroughness, as if mentally stripping away her clothes, her identity, her last tattered vestiges of dignity. There was no warmth, no flicker of pity in that hard gaze, only cold, pragmatic calculation. Maeve's voice, when she finally spoke, was as dry and brittle as the parched land outside, raspy from cheap cigars and years of barking orders. She fired off blunt, practical questions. Name? Eliza barely whispered it, the sound stolen by the thick air, knowing instinctively it wouldn't matter. Skills? Maeve let out a short, barking laugh, a humorless sound, when Eliza hesitantly mentioned sewing and cooking, her implication clear about the real skills required here. Eliza felt her name, her past, her very self evaporating under that callous scrutiny, dissolving like smoke. She was no longer Eliza, wife of Silas, mother of Lily. She was property, inventory, a new commodity to be appraised and exploited. Another tarnished bird in Maeve's squalid, gilded cage. Her worth was now measured solely in transactions, her existence defined by the crude desires of rough, transient men. The only thing anchoring her soul, preventing it from drifting away entirely, was the invisible, agonizing thread connecting her to the memory of Lily's terrified face, the echo of her stolen daughter's last desperate cry. Well, well, look what the dust devil blew in. So that worthless Silas finally settled his damn tab, did he? Maeve drawled, a humorless, cruel smirk twisting her heavily painted lips, her eyes gleaming with avarice. Forget Eliza. That name's dead wood here. You answer to Ruby now, got it? Just another mouth to feed until you start earning your keep, and you'll earn it quick, understand? Maeve rummaged through a pile of discarded clothing heaped in a dusty corner and procured a dress, a garish wine-red satin thing faded in patches, stained suspiciously near the hem, and smelling faintly of stale perfume, sweat, and despair. She tossed it contemptuously at Eliza. "Get this on," she commanded, her voice sharp, cutting. "And wash that mud-caked face. You look like you wrestled a damn tumbleweed and lost. Remember, you're Ruby. Keep your mouth shut unless a customer or I speak to you. Do exactly as you're told without sass, and learn fast how to keep the boys smilin' and spendin'. Nobody in this whole damn territory gives a tinker's damn who you were before you walked through that door." Eliza stood frozen, the flimsy, soiled dress clutched in her hand like a venomous snake. A silent scream built in her chest, a raw, desperate urge to fight, to claw her way out, to run until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. But her feet felt leaden, fused to the grimy, beer-sticky floorboards. Her terrified gaze swept the large, dimly lit main room. A handful of other women were scattered around, some slumped listlessly in worn-out stained velvet armchairs. others leaning against the walls with a practiced indifference, their eyes holding a hard, vacant glaze, their faces rigid masks of forced gaiety or etched with the weary lines of countless humiliations. A few, perhaps newer arrivals like herself, still showed a faint, terrified flicker deep in their eyes, a vulnerability that Maeve seemed to relish identifying and crushing. They glanced at Eliza with a fleeting, passive mixture of curiosity, pity, and the profound, weary indifference born of shared, inescapable misery. This was their life, their cage, and now it was hers. "Don't even think about trying to run," one of the older women muttered without looking up. Her voice raspy like dry leaves skittering across stone. She meticulously polished a shot glass with a stained rag. "Maeve's got eyes and ears everywhere. Always brings 'em back. Just makes it worse for you. Much worse. Better to just bend. Find a way to survive it." A younger woman, barely more than a girl, with limp, stringy blonde hair framing a pale face and wide, haunted blue eyes, sidled closer to Eliza, casting nervous glances towards Maeve. "I'm Clara," she whispered, her voice trembling almost uncontrollably. "Maeve, she looks mean, and she is mean, but don't fight her. Not right away, just do what she says. It's easier that way." For a while, Eliza could only manage a jerky, convulsive nod, her throat constricted with unshed tears and paralyzing terror. Maeve, impatient, grabbed Eliza's arm in a bruising grip, her fingernails digging into Eliza's flesh, and propelled her roughly up a narrow, creaking staircase hidden behind the bar. She shoved Eliza into a small, suffocating room on the second floor. It contained little more than a narrow, lumpy bed with a stained, thin mattress, a cracked ceramic pitcher and basin on a rickety washstand, and a single small, grimy window overlooking the dusty, desolate main street of Prosperity. A thick layer of dust coated every surface. This cramped, airless space, smelling faintly of mildew and despair, would be her cell. The days that followed bled into a nightmarish, monotonous blur, each one a suffocating repetition of the last. Long, dreary hours were spent scrubbing filthy floors, washing mountains of sticky glasses, serving drinks, enduring the suffocating atmosphere of the saloon, followed by shameful, terrifying nights filled with degradation and fear she pushed to the darkest corners of her mind just to survive the next sunrise. The gilded cage operated under Maeve's unyielding, iron-fisted rule. It was a place of meticulously painted-on smiles that never reached the eyes, of forced, brittle laughter that sounded hollow and desperate, of hidden tears shed silently into lumpy pillows in the dead of night. Eliza learned the bitter, brutal lessons of survival in this harsh new reality. She learned painstakingly to build an internal wall, a fortress of numbness, against the leering gazes and crude, unwelcome groping of men who saw only flesh, not the shattered, grieving woman trapped within. She learned to navigate Maeve's unpredictable moods, her casual cruelty, her sharp tongue and sudden, violent rages designed to keep everyone off balance, compliant, and perpetually afraid. She learned to recognize the subtle, different stages of despair reflected in the eyes of the other women, wondering with a chilling, visceral dread if her own would soon mirror that same vacant hopelessness. Numbly, mechanically, she performed the tasks demanded of her, fetching watered-down whiskey for Loud, rough men in the smoky main room, mopping up spilled beer and vomit from the sticky floorboards, enduring the constant barrage of vulgar jokes and unwanted, possessive touches, learning to make herself small, unobtrusive, almost invisible when possible. Her body moved through the degrading motions required for survival, but her mind frantically scrabbled for purchase, desperately searching for any chink in the bars of her cage, any whispered word, any fleeting opportunity that might lead to escape. She became an unwilling, vigilant sponge, soaking up every scrap of overheard conversation, every drunken boast, every whispered rumor exchanged between patrons or the other women, praying with desperate intensity for a mention of Silas, or, more urgently, any clue, however small, about Lily's whereabouts. "Ruby, get your lazy backside over here." Maeve's voice, sharp as broken glass, would frequently cut through the din. "These gentlemen are parched, and I ain't paying you good money to stand there daydreaming. Where did he take her? Dear God. Is she safe? Who is looking after my baby? Is she crying for me?" The questions relentlessly tormented her, sharp needles pricking at her consciousness day and night. In the suffocating darkness of her tiny, airless room, long after the last drunken customer had stumbled out, she would clutch the threadbare, receiving blanket Silas had callously packed, the only tangible link to her daughter, pressing its worn softness to her face, burying her silent sobs in the lumpy, tear-dampened pillow, whispering Lily's name into the oppressive silence. Like a prayer, the vivid image of Lily's trusting face, the clear echo of her bright, infectious laughter, became a sacred talisman, fiercely guarded against the encroaching darkness threatening to consume her. It was the sole reason she forced herself to rise each morning, to wash her face, to put on the hateful red dress, to endure, to simply breathe. "I will find you, Lilybug," she whispered fiercely into the darkness, the promise a defiant prayer against despair. "Mama will find you, I swear it on my life, I will get you back." She began to observe the other women more closely, looking for potential allies, however fragile. Clara, the frightened girl who had offered that first tentative warning, possessed a surprising core of quiet resilience beneath her fragile, trembling exterior. In stolen, hushed moments, cleaning rags together in the back, folding linens late at night, Clara shared fragments of her own story. Lured from a poor dirt farm by false promises of respectable work as a seamstress in a burgeoning town, only to find herself trapped, indebted and ensnared in Maeve's cruel web. There was Sadie, older, her face a stark roadmap of hardship and disappointment, who had been trapped in the gilded cage for so long she seemed encased in a brittle shell of cynical resignation, her sharp words and world-weary sighs a shield against further pain. And there were others, newer faces reflecting the same raw fear and bewildered disorientation Eliza felt churning inside her. In hushed whispers, during rare moments away from Maeve's omnipresent, watchful eyes, in the narrow hallway, by the back door emptying slops, they shared fragmented histories, secret sorrows, forging a fragile, unspoken camaraderie born of shared trauma and circumstance. But Maeve was perpetually vigilant, her presence a constant, oppressive shadow. She actively discouraged any real closeness among the women, expertly sowing seeds of mistrust and jealousy, using small favors, pointed criticisms and veiled threats as her primary tools of control. Any perceived infraction, any hint of defiance or solidarity was punished swiftly and harshly. Sometimes it was scathing public humiliation in front of customers. Sometimes it involved docking their meager, unfairly calculated earnings or withholding food. And sometimes, as Eliza witnessed one terrifying afternoon with horrified dread, it involved brutal lashings administered with a leather strap in the dusty back storeroom, the muffled sounds, the crack of leather, the stifled cries, unforgettable and chilling. The fear tightened its icy grip around Eliza's heart, reinforcing the constant threat. She knew with absolute bone-deep certainty that she couldn't endure this indefinitely. Her spirit, though resilient, was fraying. She had to escape. She had to reach Lily. But the obstacles seemed insurmountable, monolithic. Prosperity was an isolated island of squalor in a vast, unforgiving sea of desolate plains. Maeve guarded her property with jealous vigilance, aided by brutish men loyal only to her coin. And even if, by some miracle, she managed to slip away unnoticed, where would she go? Penniless, friendless, alone in this vast hostile territory, with no idea where Silas had taken her child. The sheer scale of the challenge threatened to drown her in hopelessness. But then, the image of Lily's face, small, trusting, waiting, would surge forward in her mind, resolute and demanding. For her daughter, she had to find the strength. She intensified her observations, listening more acutely than ever before, her mind constantly sifting through the noise, the drunken ramblings, the casual cruelty, searching relentlessly for any weakness in Maeve's fortress, any whisper of opportunity, however faint, however perilous. The need to find Lily was no longer just hope. It was a burning obsession, the only fire left burning within her. A new kind of whisper began to snake through the dusty, sun-baked streets of prosperity, carried on the same dry, relentless wind that constantly scoured the settlement. These weren't the usual sordid murmurs of gambling debts, drunken brawls, or clandestine affairs. These whispers spoke of trouble brewing to the south, simmering anger among the Comanche tribes whose ancestral hunting grounds bordered this raw, encroaching white settlement. Talk circulated in hushed, nervous tones, of lightning-fast raids, on isolated ranches under the cloak of darkness, of valuable horses disappearing without a trace, of homesteads found unnervingly empty, their occupants vanished. There were murmurs of an old anger rekindled, smoldering like embers hidden beneath dry grass, stirred into flame by fresh grievances across the summer prairie. Initially, Maeve dismissed the rumors with a contemptuous wave of her heavily ringed hand, attributing them to the overactive imaginations of easily spooked settlers and greenhorns. Bad for business, all this nervous chatter, she'd snapped, her painted smile tight. She needed to maintain an illusion of coarse, boisterous stability for her patrons. But gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, a palpable tension began to settle over the ramshackle town, thick and heavy as the ever-present dust. It coated everything with a film of unease. Even the rowdy cowboys, grizzled trappers, and itinerant laborers who frequented the gilded cage seemed edgier. Their laughter, while still loud, held a harsher, more brittle edge. Their eyes darted more frequently towards the dusty windows and the swinging doors, as if scanning the vast, empty horizon for unseen threats moving silently through the heat. Hazy Eliza, though largely cocooned in her own private misery and singular focus on Lily, couldn't help but notice the subtle, yet undeniable shift in the atmosphere. It permeated the stale, smoky air of the saloon, a subtle change in the rhythm of fear, an undercurrent beneath the forced gaiety. She started paying closer, more deliberate attention to the fragmented conversations she overheard while serving drinks or clearing sticky tables. Men spoke in lowered tones, leaning closer together over their whiskey glasses, about a particular Comanche warrior, a war leader whose name was spoken with a volatile, uneasy mixture of fear and grudging respect. Nokana. They whispered that he moved like a ghost through the tall grass, that his warriors struck like lightning and vanished just as quickly. They said he was driven by a quest for vengeance, seeking retribution for a profound offense, a specific betrayal that had struck at the very heart of his people, desecrating something sacred. Some claimed the grievance involved stolen ceremonial objects, artifacts imbued with deep spiritual power, disrespectfully handled or traded away by foolish white men. Others spoke of recently broken treaties, dishonest trade practices at outlying posts of specific white men from the vicinity who had cheated the Comanche, poisoning the already fragile, often tense coexistence. Nokona. One rough-looking buffalo hunter muttered into his whiskey one evening, nervously glancing over his shoulder towards the darkened street outside. They say he sees everything that happens on these plains. knows every track, every hidden water source, just biding his time, waiting for his moment to strike back. At first, the name Nocona meant little to Eliza, just another name tangled in the complex, often violent tapestry of frontier life, lost in the constant, aching void left by Lily's absence. But then, one sweltering, oppressive evening, as she refilled the glass of a particularly drunk and boastful fur trapper holding court near the bar, she heard him utter a name that sent a jolt of pure ice water through her veins. Silas. The trapper, his tongue thoroughly loosened by Maeve's cheap liquor, was regaling his companions with a rambling, slurred story. He claimed, with a mixture of morbid fascination and drunken pride, to have witnessed Silas, looking desperate, hunted and sweating profusely despite the evening cool down south at Henderson's makeshift saloon, frantically trade something valuable to settle a significant gambling debt just weeks prior. Something clearly not his own to trade. Something, whispered even then to be Comanche property. That fool Silas, the trapper slurred, oblivious to the woman standing frozen beside his table, her hand trembling so violently she almost dropped the heavy whiskey bottle she held. Skinny fella, all wild eyes and sweat. He gave old Henderson, you know, the one runs that rat trap down by Bitter Creek, a worn leather pouch. Heavy, it looked. Something glittered inside when Henderson peeked. Said it squared him, up for what he owed from the card table. Henderson looked spooked as hell after peeking inside, real spooked, but he snatched it quick enough. The trapper chuckled coarsely, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Funny thing is, just a few days later, Silas showed up here, dumped off his woman and kid looking like yesterday's laundry. He gestured vaguely towards Eliza without actually seeing her. Got out of Prosperity right quick after that. Smart move, I reckon, him being such a coward. Heard the Comanche were already asking pointed questions about that specific pouch 'fore he even lit out. The scattered, disparate pieces clicked into place in Eliza's mind, with a sickening, horrifying clarity. Silas, his spiraling gambling addiction, his mounting desperation, a stolen Comanche artifact, sacred, potent, and then, his sudden, urgent need for cash, leading him directly to Maeve's door, selling her to settle his immediate debts, and using Lily, her precious Lily, as collateral, elsewhere to fund his escape. Silas hadn't just abandoned and betrayed his wife and child in the most callous way imaginable. His recklessness, his selfish irresponsibility, his utter lack of honor had potentially ignited a firestorm, endangering the entire fragile settlement, perhaps even sparking wider conflict. He hadn't merely traded away the woman he'd sworn vows to protect. He had likely traded the fragile, tenuous piece of the plains itself, all to escape the consequences of his own squalid choices, his own weakness. And now, retribution wasn't just a vague whisper on the wind. It was a gathering storm cloud on the southern horizon, dark and menacing. A strange, bitter conflict churned within Eliza. Primal fear for her own safety warred with a dark, undeniable, almost satisfying sense of grim justice. Silas's actions had unleashed forces far greater and more terrible than the personal wreckage of her own life. She felt a profound, visceral revulsion for the man who had caused this, a man who had devolved from a flawed dreamer into something monstrous in her eyes. He traded us, Eliza thought, the bitterness rising like bile in her throat. Traded Lily, traded me, traded peace itself. All for a stacked deck of cards and another bottle of cheap whiskey. The tension in Prosperity ratcheted tighter with each passing day. Riders galloped in sporadically from outlying homesteads, their faces pale with fear, bringing panicked reports of sporadic attacks. Cattle driven off into the night, isolated. Cabins found ransacked and mysteriously empty. Smoke seen rising from distant, lonely ranches. Fear ceased to be a whisper and became a tangible entity, lurking in the dusty shadows between the shacks, swirling in the thick saloon smoke, reflected in the increasingly wary eyes of the inhabitants. Men started openly carrying rifles wherever they went, even just across the street. Flimsy doors were reinforced with extra bars, windows boarded up crudely. Tempers flared more easily over trivial matters, suspicion festering like a wound between neighbors who had previously shared uneasy tolerance. Shoulda run them savages off years ago, cleared 'em out proper. A red-faced man shouted angrily in the gilded cage one tense night, slamming his fist hard on the sticky bar top, making glasses jump. Now they're back for blood, thirstin' for it, and it's his damn fault. He didn't say Silas's name aloud, but the accusation hung heavy in the air. Everyone knew who he meant. Maeve, despite her increasingly strained attempts at maintaining a facade of nonchalant control, ordered extra bolts installed on the heavy front and back doors of the gilded cage. Her rouged, painted smile grew tighter, more brittle, stretched thin over her fear. But in the depths of her cold, calculating eyes, Eliza saw it clearly now. The same raw fear that held the rest of the frightened town captive. Everyone just keep calm and carry on. Maeve snapped at the women one afternoon, her voice unnaturally high-pitched and strained. Just a bit of excitement, that's all it is. A few restless bucks making trouble. It'll blow over. Now keep the customers happy, pour the drinks, and earn your keep. Eliza felt utterly trapped, a helpless pawn caught in the crosscurrents of a deadly game initiated by her husband's treachery. Her fate, and perhaps Lily's too, wherever she was, seemed inextricably linked to the righteous gathering fury of a people she had never met. A tribe wronged by the man who should have been her protector, her partner. She gazed out of her small, grimy window at the vast plains stretching towards a sunset that bled fiery, ominous red across the western horizon, looking disturbingly like spilled blood staining the sky. She wondered, with a chilling mix of profound dread and a strange, reckless flicker of desperate hope, if the coming storm would bring utter annihilation, or if, in its violent, purging passage, it might inadvertently blast open a path to freedom she couldn't possibly carve for herself. Maybe this is it, Eliza thought, her hand instinctively tightening around the memory of Lily, a memory more real, more solid than the sordid, suffocating room around her. Maybe the fire that finally burns this wretched place down will be the very one that lights my way out. The thought was terrifying, yet strangely liberating. The night Nokona and his warriors descended upon Prosperity arrived under a vast, star-dusted, but utterly moonless sky, a deep canopy of black velvet devoid of any gentle, revealing light. An unnatural hush fell over the ragged settlement first, a silence deeper and heavier than the usual quiet of the high plains night. Even the incessant wind seemed to hold its breath, pausing its mournful song. Somewhere on the edge of the cluster of tents and shacks, a dog began to bark frantically, a high-pitched, escalating sound of pure panic that was abruptly, chillingly cut short, leaving behind a silence even more profound and menacing. "It's too quiet," Clara whispered, her thin body trembling uncontrollably as she huddled close to Eliza near the back wall of the saloon, instinctively seeking shelter in the shadows. "Something awful's coming, Ruby. I can feel it in my bones." Then, the sounds began shattering the pregnant stillness like thrown stones hitting glass. A sharp, splintering crash from the far end of the settlement, the sound of wood giving way violently, followed instantaneously by a single piercing, human scream that was brutally silenced almost as soon as it began, and then, growing rapidly louder like the rumble of distant thunder transforming into an immediate, terrifying roar, came the drumming of unshod hooves pounding the hard-packed earth. Dozens of them, a dark, relentless tide of sound rolling, inexorably towards the heart of Prosperity, towards the gilded cage. Chaos erupted within the saloon's stifling confines. Men who had been drinking, gambling, laughing, and boasting mere moments before scrambled violently from their chairs, their faces suddenly pale masks of terror, eyes wide with disbelief and fear. They fumbled desperately for Colt revolvers tucked into belts or hidden in boots, searching wildly for any semblance of cover behind overturned tables or beneath the bar. Maeve shrieked contradictory orders, her voice cracking with panic, lost in the rising tide of hysteria. Furniture scraped violently across the floor, glasses shattered, whiskey bottles tumbled and smashed, adding the sharp smell of alcohol to the thick air. "Down! Everybody get down!" Maeve screamed, her carefully constructed composure finally shattering like cheap, brittle glass. "Under the tables! Get under the damn tables! Now!" The heavy front doors didn't simply open, they exploded inwards, ripped violently from their hinges by a focused, explosive force that spoke of calculated rage, showering the room with jagged splinters of wood and dust. Dark, lean figures moved with terrifying speed and agility through the swirling dust motes illuminated by the dim, flickering lamplight. They were sinewy bodies stripped for battle, torsos gleaming faintly with sweat, faces obscured by stark, intimidating patterns of black and white war paint that seemed to absorb the dim light, making their features indistinct and menacing. Their eyes, however, burned with a cold, implacable fury. Comanche warriors, swift, silent, deadly. "Oh, sweet Mary, Mother of God, they're here!" Clara sobbed hysterically, burying her face hard against Eliza's shoulder, her body shaking like a leaf in a gale. Acting on pure, primal instinct honed by weeks of fear and observation, Eliza grabbed Clara's thin arm, pulling the terrified girl down with force behind a heavy, overturned oak card table in a relatively dark corner of the room, shielded partially by a structural post. Peeking cautiously through a narrow gap between the tabletop and the floor, Eliza witnessed fragmented glimpses of the unfolding scene, swift, brutal, and terrifyingly precise. This wasn't the random, chaotic violence prosperity usually witnessed during drunken Saturday nights. This was targeted, methodical, efficient. The warriors flowed through the room like ghosts, their movements fluid and economical, largely ignoring the cowering, whimpering patrons huddled under tables or the small group of terrified women pressed against the back wall. Their immediate purpose, it seemed, wasn't wholesale slaughter or looting. They're looking for something, or someone specific, Eliza realized, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Then she saw him, Nokona. He moved through the chaos with a palpable, commanding presence that instantly set him apart from the others. Taller than most of his warriors, he radiated an aura of contained power and coiled intensity. He moved with a lethal, predatory grace, his piercing, intelligent eyes sweeping the ruined room, missing nothing in the dim, chaotic light. For one heart-stopping, terrifying moment, his gaze met Eliza's across the ruined space. She saw no specific malice directed at her, only a profound, ancient anger, deep and unyielding as the bedrock beneath the plains. He wasn't looking for her, or for the other women trapped like her. His focus was elsewhere. "He's not after us," Eliza whispered urgently, fiercely into Clara's ear, trying to quell the girl's violent, helpless trembling. "Stay down. He wants Maeve." As if summoned by the thought, Nokona's intense, unwavering gaze locked onto Maeve. She was attempting to scrabble deeper behind the heavy, overturned bar, her face stripped bare of its usual haughty arrogance and thick paint, revealing only raw, primal terror beneath the smeared cosmetics. Nokona moved towards her, deliberate, unhurried, relentless. He spoke, his voice low but resonant, carrying clearly over the remaining whimpers and chaos. He spoke not in English, but in the sharp, guttural tones of his own tongue. Words Eliza couldn't understand but whose import was unmistakable. "Maeve, clearly didn't comprehend the specific words either, but the intent, the deadly promise of imminent retribution, was terrifyingly universal, communicated through tone, posture, and the burning fury in his eyes. What do you want?" Maeve stammered, her voice thin and reedy, cracking with pure fear. "Take the money, there's cash in the box. Take the whiskey, take anything." Nocona ignored her desperate babbling pleas. Perhaps he sought the specific stolen sacred object Silas had so foolishly bartered away. Perhaps he sought vengeance for the very existence of this place, this gilded cage, a festering symbol of the corruption, exploitation, and degradation the white settlers had brought to his people's land. Or perhaps his reasons were deeper, more complex, rooted in generations of broken promises and stolen lives, known only to him and the spirits of his ancestors. He reached down towards her. "I don't have it," Maeve shrieked suddenly, desperation making her reckless for one fatal second. "He took it. That cheating, lying bastard Silas, he traded it away down south. He took it and ran." Eliza squeezed her eyes shut tightly, pressing her face hard against the rough, splintered wood of the table, unable, unwilling, to watch the inevitable, brutal conclusion. She heard a strangled, gurgling cry, the sickening, heavy thud of impact, the brief sound of a desperate, futile struggle, then a profound, chilling silence from that direction. The sounds, sharp, brutal, and final, etched themselves indelibly into her memory, burning behind her closed eyelids. When she dared to open, her eyes again trembling, Maeve was gone from view behind the bar. Nocona stood near the shattered doorway, his broad painted back to the interior of the ruined saloon, silhouetted momentarily against the star-dusted darkness outside. The expression on his face, visible for a fleeting moment as he turned slightly, scanning the room one last time, was grim, impassive, unreadable, but held a distinct sense of harsh, necessary finality, a task completed. He paused, his dark gaze sweeping once more over the terrified women huddled together in the corner, a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps pity for their plight, perhaps contempt for their circumstances, crossing his stern features. He gave no indication of intending them any further harm. Then, as swiftly and silently as they had arrived, he turned and melted back into the moonless night. The other warriors followed him without a sound, dissolving like smoke into the vast darkness of the plains. "They're gone," Clara whispered, her voice choked with ragged, relieved sobs, her body still trembling violently. "They're really gone." The raid was over almost as suddenly as it had begun. The few remaining patrons, dazed men lucky or perhaps simply insignificant enough to have been ignored in the focused onslaught, scrambled frantically out of the wreckage, stumbling over debris, desperate to escape, disappearing into the terrified, echoing silence of prosperity. A profound, almost unnatural quiet descended upon the ruined, gilded cage, thick with the lingering stench of gunpowder, spilled liquor, stirred up dust, and the sharp, unmistakable metallic tang of fear and spilled blood. The cage, violently, terrifyingly, was broken. In the echoing, stunned silence that followed the Comanche onslaught, a silence broken only by Clara's ragged breathing and the distant, mournful howl of a lone coyote, Eliza slowly, unsteadily, pushed herself to her feet. Her legs felt weak, shaky. The main room of the gilded cage was a scene of utter, shocking devastation. Overturned tables lay like fallen, wounded beasts. Shattered glass crunched treacherously underfoot with every hesitant step. Chairs lay splintered and broken, and the air hung thick and heavy with the acrid, nauseating cocktail of destruction. A few of the other women remained huddled together near the back wall, some sobbing hysterically into their hands, others staring blankly into the wreckage, their eyes wide and vacant, numb with shock and terror. But amidst the pervasive fear and the tangible chaos, a fragile, almost unbelievable realization began to dawn in Eliza's mind, cutting through the fog of shock. The cage was broken. Maeve, the architect of their daily misery, the cruel arbiter of their fates, was gone. Her reign of terror, like the splintered furniture and shattered mirrors, lay irrevocably shattered. There was nothing, no one, holding them here now. We can leave," Clara whispered, the words catching in her throat, disbelief warring with a nascent, fragile flicker of hope lighting her tear-filled eyes. She looked at Eliza, her expression pleading for confirmation. "We're free, Ruby." "Eliza, we can actually just walk out, can't we?" But Eliza's mind, honed sharp by weeks of singular obsessive focus and now jolted into hyper-clarity by adrenaline, bypassed the immediate dawning relief of potential freedom. Lily, always Lily, Silas's despicable betrayal, had inadvertently brought the wrath of Nokona down upon this place, and that wrath, terrifying and destructive as it was, had smashed open her prison. But where was her daughter? The urgency wasn't just a thought, it was a physical pain, a sharp ache deep in her chest. Every second wasted felt like a betrayal of her child. "We have to go." "Now," Eliza said, her voice low but firm, imbued with a sudden authority that cut through the stunned inertia gripping the other women. She grabbed Clara's trembling arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Clara, think hard, please. Did you ever hear Silas mention where he might have gone after he left Prosperity? Any place? Any name? Anything at all?" Clara shook her head mutely, still dazed, her eyes darting nervously around the ruined room. Then she stopped, her brow furrowing deeply in concentration, rubbing her temples as if trying to physically extract a memory. He was always talking about debts," she stammered, her voice uneven. "Said he owed money everywhere, from cards mostly. He did mention—" "Yes, I remember now. The trading post, downriver from here. Run by an old man, Jedediah, that was the name. Said he owed Jedediah big from way back and, oh God, Ruby, Eliza." Clara's face went even paler, her eyes widening with dawning horror. "He said something about leaving collateral there. That's the word he used. Said old Jedediah would hold on to it till Silas came back flush with cash. Collateral." The word struck Eliza with the force of a physical blow, stealing her breath, constricting her heart with an icy, suffocating fist. Her daughter, her precious, innocent Lily, traded, pawned like a cheap, disposable trinket to cover a gambling debt. Silas's cruelty, his utter lack of humanity, plumbed depths she hadn't thought possible, depths blacker than the moonless night outside. Yet amidst the searing pain and waves of nauseating revulsion, a clear direction, a tangible destination, finally emerged from the thick fog of despair. A specific place, a name. Jedediah's trading post, downriver. A desperate, fragile spark of hope ignited in the overwhelming darkness. Tiny, but fiercely bright. "I'm coming with you, Ruby. Eliza," Clara said, her voice gaining a little strength, a flicker of resolve entering her eyes as she made the decision. "I'm not staying here another minute. Not after this." Eliza didn't look back at the ruined saloon, the place of her humiliation and captivity. She didn't spare a thought for the terrified, paralyzed town hunkering down in the darkness behind her. Her focus was absolute, narrowed like a hawk's gaze to the single goal burning within her. Lily, guided by the distant silvery track of the river gleaming faintly under the starlight and her own desperate maternal instinct, they followed the rough, barely discernible path leading downstream, away from the raw scar of Prosperity. Her flimsy shoes, hastily grabbed from Maeve's discarded pile, offered little protection against the sharp stones, treacherous roots, and thorny scrub that tore at her skirt and skin. The vast, indifferent expanse of the high plain stretched out around them, dark, silent, and immense. But this time, the emptiness didn't feel crushing or threatening. It felt like possibility, a terrifying but open space, a blank page waiting to be written. The journey was arduous, brutal. Hunger gnawed relentlessly at Eliza's stomach, a constant dull ache reminding her of their vulnerability. Thirst became a torment, cracking her lips, thickening her tongue, making swallowing painful. The Texas sun, when it rose, beat down mercilessly, reflecting blindingly off the pale earth, offering no shade, no respite, but the vivid, cherished image of Lily's face, her bright smile, her trusting dark eyes, the heart-wrenching sound of her last terrified cry, propelled Eliza forward, fueling her exhausted body when sheer willpower failed. She pushed, onward relentlessly, driven by a force stronger than hunger, thirst, or exhaustion. They walked during the brutal daylight hours, resting only briefly when the heat became unbearable. At night they huddled together for shared warmth and meager comfort under the vast, cold, star-studded sky, sleeping fitfully, startled awake by every rustle in the darkness, every distant animal cry. Eliza scavenged desperately for edible berries and roots she vaguely recalled from childhood lessons back east, recognizing precious few plants in this alien landscape. They drank sparingly from the silty, slow-moving river, hoping the water wouldn't make them sick. Clara, though weakened and clearly frightened by their exposure and uncertainty, proved surprisingly resourceful. Her farm girl knowledge helped them avoid poisonous plants and find small pockets of slightly cleaner water seeped from rocks. They spoke little, conserving precious energy, but their shared ordeal, their mutual escape from hell, forged a silent, powerful bond of reliance and understanding between them. Eliza lost all track of time. Days blurred into a grueling cycle of walking, desperate foraging, brief, exhausted rest, and walking again. Was it 2 days? 3? 4? It didn't matter. All that mattered was putting one aching foot in front of the other, moving steadily downstream, towards the only lead she had, the single flickering candle of hope in the vast darkness. Finally, when her legs felt like lead pipes, her feet were raw and bleeding, and despair threatened to finally overwhelm her weakening resolve, she saw it. Through eyes blurred by exhaustion and sun glare, nestled in a shallow, willow-lined bend of the river, stood a low, sturdy building constructed of rough-hewn logs, chinked securely with mud. A thin, welcoming plume of wood smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney into the clear blue sky. A crude wooden sign hung near the solid front door, the painted letters faded by sun and time, but still legible. Jedediah's Trading Post. "There!" Eliza breathed, the word escaping her cracked lips as a hoarse whisper. She pointed with a trembling hand, her heart leaping violently in her chest. "Clara, look! That must be it! It has to be!" Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, painful drumbeat of overwhelming fear mixed with desperate, almost unbearable hope. What if Silas lied? What if Lily isn't here? What if he came back and took her already? What if Jedediah is cruel, unhelpful, like Maeve? She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm the storm within her, smoothed down her ragged, torn dress as best she could, wiped the grime from her face with the back of her hand, and forced her trembling legs to move forward, towards the solid wooden door that represented either salvation or the final crushing of her spirit. Clara, sensing the enormity of the moment, placed a supportive, trembling hand on Eliza's shoulder. "Ready?" Eliza whispered, the word barely audible, lost almost as soon as it left her lips. "As I'll ever be." Clara whispered back, her voice thick with shared anxiety and hope. Taking one last fortifying breath, praying silently to a god she wasn't sure still listened, Eliza pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. Inside Jedediah's trading post, the air was cool and smelled richly of tanned leather, pipe tobacco, ground coffee, dust motes dancing in the sunbeams slanting through the windows, and the faint, reassuring scent of wood smoke. An elderly man with a kind, deeply weathered face framed by a flowing, neatly trimmed white beard looked up from behind a long wooden counter laden with a diverse, orderly array of goods. Bolts of brightly colored calico, sturdy sacks of flour and beans, gleaming axe heads and traps, barrels of nails, jars of preserves, tools, and tobacco twists. His eyes, initially wary and assessing at the sudden appearance of two disheveled, clearly desperate women emerging seemingly from the empty wilderness, held a spark of inherent decency, a quiet wisdom earned through long years on the frontier. Excuse me, sir," Eliza began, her voice shaking uncontrollably with a potent cocktail of exhaustion, terror, and almost unbearable anticipation. Her throat felt raw, tight. "I'm looking for Mr. Jedediah." "That'd be me," the old man replied, his voice gentle but steady, carrying a resonance of quiet authority. He took in their ragged appearance, the torn clothes, the dust-streaked faces, the raw desperation etched deeply onto Eliza's features, the exhaustion clinging to both of them like a shroud. "What troubles you, ladies? You look like you've come through a hard time." With tears finally breaking free, streaming unchecked down her grimy cheeks, Eliza poured out her story, edited by necessity, omitting the worst horrors and degradation of the gilded cage, focusing instead on her forced, cruel separation from her daughter, the recklessness and betrayal of her husband Silas, and the terrible, chilling word Clara had overheard, collateral. She looked Jedediah straight in the eye, her gaze pleading, willing him to understand the raw, primal desperation of a mother robbed of her child, her only reason for living. "Please, sir," Eliza pleaded, her voice breaking on a sob, her hands twisting together in her lap. "My little girl, Lily. She's only a baby. She's all I have left in this world. He, my husband, mentioned leaving her here as collateral for a debt. Please, is she here? Is she safe?" Jedediah listened patiently, stroking his white beard thoughtfully, his expression growing increasingly somber and tinged with sorrow as she spoke. When she finally finished, her voice choked with emotion, he let out a long, heavy sigh and shook his head slowly, not in negation, but in profound sadness and disapproval. "Silas," he murmured, the name spoken softly but heavy with judgment. "Aye, the fool came through here all right, wild-eyed and running scared, looking over his shoulder the whole time. Owed me plenty from way back. Always chasing shadows, that one." He paused, his gaze softening with unmistakable compassion as he looked at Eliza's anguished, tear-streaked face. He saw past the dirt and rags to the wounded mother beneath. "And yes, lass, he did leave the little one," Eliza gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Said he needed her looked after, safe-like, claimed he was going off to make his fortune and would be back in a few days, flush, to settle his debts and fetch her." Jedediah continued, his voice gentle. "Called her collateral right enough, though I didn't like the sound of it one bit. Seemed unnatural, but—" He shrugged slightly, his eyes meeting Eliza's, now filled not with wariness, but with profound empathy. "Couldn't just leave the poor mite alone out here, could we? Martha, that's my wife, she took her right in. Said he'd be back soon, that was longer ago than a few days now. Never showed hide nor hair." He gestured with a calloused, steady hand towards a sturdy wooden door set in the wall connecting, the trading post to a small, neat log cabin attached to the side. She's in there now, safe and sound with Martha, playing happy as a lark last I looked. Eliza's breath caught sharply in her throat. Her heart felt as if it might physically burst from her chest with a tumultuous, overwhelming surge of relief so profound, so intense, it was almost painful. She felt lightheaded, swaying slightly, on her feet. She could barely stand, her legs threatening to buckle beneath her after the long, arduous journey and the crushing weight of fear she'd carried. She followed Jedediah numbly towards the connecting door, each step feeling both leaden with exhaustion and impossibly weightless with anticipation. Her entire being, every nerve, every fiber, was focused on the threshold just ahead. He pushed. The door opened gently, revealing a simple, clean, cozy room. And there, sitting on a colorful rag rug spread on the clean-swept wooden floor, bathed in the soft, warm light filtering through a nearby window, hung with simple gingham curtains, was Lily. She was completely engrossed in stacking small, brightly painted wooden blocks into a wobbly tower. Her dark, silky hair was slightly tousled, framing a face perhaps a little thinner than Eliza remembered, marked by a small smudge of dirt on one cheek. But it was unmistakably, blessedly her Lily, her light, her entire world, sitting there, whole and unharmed. At the sound of the door opening, Lily looked up from her blocks, her small brow furrowing slightly in concentration at the sight of the stranger standing in the doorway. Then her dark eyes widened, a spark of bewildered, hesitant recognition flickering within their innocent depths. A tiny, questioning sound escaped her lips, soft as a sigh. "Mama?" The single word, fragile as a bird's egg yet strong enough to shatter the remaining fragments of Eliza's carefully guarded composure, hung suspended in the quiet, sunlit air. A choked, guttural sob tore from Eliza's throat. She stumbled forward, dropping heavily to her knees on the rough but clean floorboards, her arms flung wide, tears blurring her vision. Recognition fully dawned in Lily's eyes, bright and certain now. She scrambled clumsily to her feet, letting the wooden blocks tumble to the floor with a soft clatter, and ran, unsteady on her small legs but determined, straight into her mother's waiting embrace. Eliza wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her so tightly she feared she might break her fragile bones, yet utterly unable to loosen her grip. She buried her face in Lily's soft, tangled hair, inhaling deeply the unique, beloved scent of her child. The scent of innocence, of belonging, of the one pure, unbreakable connection that had sustained her through the abyss of the gilded cage. Hot, cleansing tears flowed freely down her face, washing away the dust of the journey, the grime of captivity, the bitter residue of fear, humiliation, and agonizing uncertainty. She wept for the precious time lost, for the horrors she had endured, for the terror her daughter must have felt. But most of all, she wept with the overwhelming, shattering, exquisite joy of reunion. "Lily! Oh, my Lily-bug, my sweet baby," Eliza sobbed, rocking her daughter gently back and forth, her voice thick and broken. "Mama's here. Mama found you. I'm never, ever leaving you again. Never. I promise you. I promise." Lily clung tightly to her mother's neck with surprising strength, her small body shaking with answering sobs, her own hot tears wetting Eliza's dusty shoulder. Relief, confusion, and the simple, profound trust of a child reunited with her. Anchor poured out of her in hiccuping cries. "Mama! Mama back!" she cried, her voice muffled against Eliza's neck. "I missed you, Mama. So much. Where, Papa?" The last question was small, confused. Martha, Jedediah's wife, a sturdy woman with kind, crinkled eyes and lines of gentle humor etched around her mouth, stood quietly by the doorway, a silent, compassionate witness to their raw, sacred reunion. She offered no intrusive words, simply allowed the powerful moment to unfold, her presence radiating a quiet strength and deep, empathetic understanding. She and Jedediah, strangers bound only by simple human decency, had sheltered her child, kept her safe, offered kindness in a world that had shown Eliza mostly cruelty. Kindness, Eliza realized with a fresh wave of grateful tears, still existed, a stubborn wildflower blooming even in the harshest, most unforgiving terrain. Their unassuming goodness was a soothing balm on her raw, wounded soul. As the first tempest of overwhelming emotion began to subside, Martha gently approached, helping Eliza to a sturdy wooden chair by the hearth, offering her a dipper of cool, clean water, and then a thick slice of freshly baked bread with butter. Quietly, kindly, she recounted Lily's days with them, how frightened and tearful the little girl had been initially, constantly crying for her mama, refusing food, but how she had gradually responded to their gentle, patient care, started playing with the wooden toys Jedediah had carved, and even offering tentative, shy smiles. Jedediah joined them, leaning against the doorframe, his expression one of paternal concern mixed with weary resignation about men like Silas. "That's Silas," he said quietly, shaking his head again, packing tobacco into his pipe. "Heard tell, downriver he lit out for California not long after passing through here, chasing gold fever like so many other fools heading west. Left a trail of broken promises and unpaid debts clean across Texas, I reckon. Don't figure you'll be seeing him again anytime soon, lass. Men like that, they blow away like tumbleweeds in the wind, leaving others to clean up their mess." Eliza nodded numbly, absorbing the words. She knew deep down that Jedediah was right. Silas was gone, vanished into the vast, consuming maw of the West, another broken man swallowed whole by his own broken dreams and fatal weaknesses. The sharp sting of his betrayal remained, a deep, permanent scar on her heart. But it was now overshadowed, diminished, by the radiant, life-affirming warmth of holding Lily safely in her arms again. The horrors of the gilded cage, the degradation, the constant fear, those wounds would take time to heal, perhaps leaving permanent traces on her spirit, changing her in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. But sitting there in the quiet sanctuary of that simple, clean cabin, Lily's small hand gripping hers tightly, her head resting trustingly against Eliza's side, Eliza felt a new resilience blooming within her, a profound strength forged in the crucible of suffering and despair. She had survived. She had endured unimaginable betrayal, brutal captivity, and soul-crushing terror. She had crossed a desolate, hostile landscape driven by nothing but a mother's fierce, unyielding love. And she had found her reason for living, reclaimed her light from the darkness. She and Lily possessed nothing now but the ragged clothes, on their backs their shared trauma, and the fierce, unbreakable love that bound them together like steel. But as Eliza looked out the small window at the wide, sunlit plain stretching towards the distant horizon, she no longer saw a landscape of fear, emptiness, and threat. She saw possibility, a daunting, uncertain future. Yes, fraught with hardship and unknowns, but also a blank page, a chance to build something new, something honest, something theirs. From the ashes of her former life, she had Lily. She had herself, scarred undeniably but fundamentally unbroken, tempered like fine steel in the hottest fire. Nokona's vengeful storm, born of injustice and aimed at destruction, had inadvertently liberated her, shattering the gilded bars of her prison and setting her paradoxically free. "We're going to be all right, Lilybug," Eliza whispered, kissing the top of her daughter's head. feeling the soft, reassuring beat of her pulse against her lips. "Mama will make sure of it. We'll find our way. We'll be all right." Clara stood near, the doorway leaning against the frame, a tentative, exhausted smile finally reaching her eyes. A fellow survivor sharing this fragile, precious moment of peace and improbable reunion. Beneath the vast, watchful expanse of the Texas sky, now appearing less indifferent and more protective, Eliza knew the path ahead remained steep and difficult. There would be more challenges, more hardships, but she would walk it, step by determined step, her daughter's small, precious hand held firmly, securely, in hers. They would find their place. They would carve out a life built not on shifting, treacherous dreams and broken promises, but on the solid, unshakable foundation of love, resilience, and hard-won strength. For the first time since Silas had cruelly driven away, leaving her daughter's desperate cries echoing in the swirling crimson dust, Eliza felt a quiet, tentative peace settle deep within her soul. The ember of hope, so carefully, fiercely guarded, through the suffocating darkness was fanned by reunion, ready to glow brighter, casting a steady, enduring light to guide their way forward into the unknown, waiting dawn.